Well, you know, when they talk about the hungry in the world, 60% are in Africa. 60% of the world's hungry are in Africa. And that is a very big contradiction, because Africa is supposedly an agricultural economy. We don't have industries, and we are dependent on agriculture, or a great majority of the people are. But the agriculture in Africa has been destroyed, has been undermined and weakened, and has collapsed in many countries, because the IMF and World Bank came into these countries and saw that the governments were giving a lot of support to small family farmers. Research on seeds, providing them with dams and roads and transport, marketing facilities and storage facilities, which the European small farmers also need. But in Africa, the IMF and World Bank forbid the governments to give this kind of support. And so agriculture collapsed. And the IMF, and particularly the World Bank, said, no, you can depend on, you know, the United States can produce maize much more cheaply than you can. So what has been the result? Our small farmers have collapsed and have come into town, into the cities, where there is no work, where there is overcrowding, and they live in slums, and there's no water, and there's no energy, and there's no jobs. And what we are doing? We are importing food from the United States. Heavily subsidized maize and wheat and meat and so on from the United States. A highly industrialized country, and we are importing food. We are also importing a lot of food from Europe. And this is because Europe insists that we must open up our economies to European exporters. So we are buying European fruit and vegetables. We are buying Spanish canned tomatoes, where we used to produce our own tomatoes and can our own tomatoes and tomato puree. Now we are importing from Spain. And we are importing olive oil and canola oil from Germany and from Greece and so on. We used to produce that ourselves. And we are importing cheese and yogurt from France. And we have cattle, we can produce these things. And we have companies like Primer Món from Italy who have come to, even to South Africa, which is a semi-industrialized country, and they have bought up dairy factories. And instead of being supplied from small farmers in the area, which was the case before, they are producing cheese and yogurt and milk. They are importing powdered milk from Europe. Now, what is the effect of all this is that our small farmers, even medium farmers, are losing their livelihoods, and our economies have to pay for these imports. Have to pay for these imports. So we are caught in a constant cycle of struggling to survive. So we now in Africa, we have to export more minerals, more gold, more copper, more platinum, and so on and so on. Diamonds, we have to export our minerals. We have to cut down our forests. We have to, instead of growing food, we are now, on the advice of the World Bank, we are growing flowers to export to Europe, and luxurious fruit, mange tout, and mushrooms to export to Europe, in order to earn money to buy maize, meal, that our population needs to eat. So Africa has now been caught in a terrible vice, a terrible imprisonment because of the IMF and World Bank. And then the WTO, the World Trade Organization, comes along and enforces this even further. And the ultimate crisis that we now face is that the European Union, which is faced with its own difficulties, the European countries are faced with many difficulties of competing with newly emerging economies in Asia and Latin America and so on. And the Brussels bureaucrats are very determined to make Europe competitive throughout the world. It is called a policy of global Europe. And for them, the most important export that Europe must now develop, and where Europe has competitive advantage, is in services, okay? Financial services, construction services, transport services, legal services, environmental services, leisure, filmmaking, and so on. This is Europe's, and in fact, on an average, 60% of Europe's GDP is services. And something like 70% of European employment is services, okay? within Europe and to export from Europe. So now Europe is demanding that our economies, which have already been forced to open up to agriculture and manufacturers and so on, now we must open up to European services. And the Europeans are calling this economic partnership agreements. You know, it sounds very nice. But in fact, you know, we see it as a form of recolonization, because we must open our banks, we must open our services, we must open every sector to European companies. And in these economic partnership agreements, there is something called liberalization of government procurement. What is government procurement? It is governments giving contracts to local suppliers to build a clinic or to supply laundry services or whatever, hospital services. If a European company makes a tender for a contract, they are saying that African governments cannot give preference to local companies. They must open up to the most competitive company. Well, of course, the most competitive company is likely to be a European company. And this is not only Africa, because Europe is following the same policy. They call it free trade agreements, Accordo de Comércio Livre. But it is not about trade, you know. It is about opening up our economies. So we are calling this, you know, recolonization. But this global Europe policy is also very bad for Europeans, because to be competitive in the world, Europe has to cut its costs in Europe. You know, it has to change the labor laws, it has to reduce the social costs, it has to increase productivity, it has to put pressure on European people so that European companies can be competitive in the rest of the world. And that is, I think, I don't know a lot about Europe, but what I hear from Europe, it is what is happening. That Europe is being turned into a Europe of the corporations to serve the interests, the international interests of European corporations. And so, even before this current crisis that is hitting the whole world, the countries of the South, you know, have been suffering from the IMF and World Bank, from the World Trade Organization, and from these free trade agreements. From Europe, also from the United States, okay? And now we have China that says it also wants free trade agreements with us, you know? So the weaker countries in the world are faced with very unjust pressures from globalized capitalism.